Pictures of shaggy-haired men were stapled to the walls. Above them hung images of violins, contrabasses, thumb harps, and cowhide lutes. There were things to be blown and things to be beaten. Some had legs and some had lids. Images of every known instrument stretched across the room like paper laundry. Robert Schumann was chalked in bold letters on the blackboard, and the name Clara spun in the middle of the record player. The music ended in a hiss, and with a scratch the needle was clicked into its quiet spot. "Wasn't that delightful, children?" said Sister Cecelia to her music class. "That music was popular over 100 years ago, and it's still popular today. We're lucky to hear it, for it was all written down. Most of the world's music was not written at all, so most of it is lost forever." The sister held up a photograph of what looked like a little boat with an odd turned-up end, and continued. "This is a harp from Egypt. When Cleopatra was queen, music was already ancient. But it's all gone. We have their temples and statues and even little harps, some just like this one, brought out of a tomb in perfect condition. But can it play? Yes, it can, but not their music. So, children, be glad that most of our music is written down. And one day, when you've learned an instrument well, you'll play waltzes and nocturnes, and maybe even symphonies." Now, we just heard the music of Clara Schumann. She lived in a country far across the ocean. Does anyone remember where? And she pointed to a tattered map covered with pushpins. "There, in Germany, of course," blurted out little Laura, who was a very precocious child. Then she turned her eyes towards the window and went back to daydreaming. "Very good, Laura," said the sister. "Now I would like you all to listen to one more symphony before lunchtime." Sister Cecelia had taught music all her long life. Her methods were innovative and often novel. Every day she went back into the coat room and pulled out a large trunk on wheels. It was full of all kinds of whistles, flutes, and noisemakers. She timed her watch for 3 minutes, and then the class made the biggest, loudest racket possible. She said it was good for stimulation, and by contrast, made the music played during her lesson all the sweeter. She had read every book on the subject of music, and some of them twice. She knew the best stories about composers, their wives and lovers, about double-jointed violinists, and why pianos had 3 pedals and 3 legs. She knew everything. She told so many strange stories that some of the other teachers said that she made them up, spun tales, just to keep the children's attention. But they could only talk about numbers and punctuation marks, so their children always acted like Lara, except they never got the right answers. Sister Cecelia even encouraged questions, and she always answered them with one of her stories. Some left the children speechless, as if under a spell. Just as she was about to lower the needle for the next symphony, Paul, a bushy-haired boy who took things quite literally, raised his hand. "Sister Cecelia, what is the music like in hell? Is it written out? Do they have symphonies too?" "What an unusual string of questions," she said. "I like that, Paul. You're thinking. And I'll give an unusual answer with my usual stories. But first, let's give this some thought. Music in hell. Well, I've never been there, of course, but you don't have to go too far to imagine the sound of it. God forbid we should ever know the answer firsthand. But we do have imaginations, and that's the key, you see, to let yourself go, to imagine things. Now you might think that hell is full of sad songs, all dirges and laments. But no, that requires tenderness, and tenderness is as scarce in hell as ice cream. They would approach things very differently down there. Good is bad, and bad is good. It would be all sort of backwards. But not exactly backwards, and odd as it may seem, I think that hell mirrors life up here on earth. More like the image in a funhouse mirror, though, all distorted and buggy-eyed, never clear and clean. So I think there are equivalents between the two places. I'm sure that there are classrooms in hell and all kinds of other things, but they would not be the same. There are little children in hell, that's for sure. Oh, but they're not like you because you're all very, very good. 2 stories come to mind concerning music in hell, and if you'll all move in a little closer, I'll tell them to you. You can even take off your shoes and sit on the floor if you like. But promise me one thing, don't tell anybody else. They might not be so free-spirited. Let's just keep it all between you and me, just like a secret. The children sat wide-eyed and motionless, except Paul, who rocked on the edge of his seat. Even Laura's eyes were as big as kettle drums. One day, a long time ago, the choir boys of hell were behaving most unsatisfactorily. Perhaps they weren't causing enough trouble. Maybe they were singing in tune. One can only imagine. So the devil had all these little demons brought into his throne room, where he pondered their punishment. He decided to send them away. "Go out and learn to make a mess of things," he screamed at them. Then he sucked in and blew out a giant fireball, and every one of those little demon choir boys was blown out of hell like the top off of a volcano. They flew in all directions. One of them bounced along the mountains, somersaulted over a valley, and spun towards a town. He whirled round and round 2 massive spires, then fell all the way down. With wings askew and eyes still bouncing, he looked up at steps leading to a great cathedral. He was awestruck by the splendor of the thing, and never having seen one before, he was quite afraid to enter it. But remembering his mission, he pumped up his wings and flapped in through the deep-carved portal. "What a magnificent playhouse!" he exclaimed. Then he blew out candles, tripped the choir master, bent organ pipes, and whispered naughty words into the ears of the faithful as they sang hymns. Just when he started breaking windows, the woven angels on the altar cloth heard him and shook their fingers at him, saying, "Mend your wicked ways, little demon, or there's no hope for you." "Never, never, never," he screeched back at them. "Catch me if you can, you sexless rags." And with that he let out a fireball and propelled himself to the ceiling. At once he was turned into stone, and there he sits to this day, witnessing all human comings and goings, parades of saints, choirs of angels, and an occasional wayward demon. "If only that little demon could speak," said Paul. "He could tell us what the music sounded like." "There's more to the lesson, Paul, "Sit down and listen," said the sister. Once upon a time there was a tidy little town, full of pleasant people. Down one of the well-swept streets, where everyone, even the poorest of the poor, kept a window box of cheerful flowers, one box was conspicuously empty. There lived a musician, a self-taught pianist, and he had no time for window boxes, for he spent all the time he could composing. Manuscripts were piled in neat high stacks all around the rented room. Those at the bottom were yellow with age, and those at the top smelled of fresh ink. Everyone in the town liked him, for he was so kind and good and loving. He always smiled at their children and complimented them on their beautiful flowers. Many said that he was the best fellow in all the world. But his compositions struck everyone as being, in a word, disturbing. They called them awful. He called them sonatas, and there were lots of them, and they were all loud and incomprehensible. If he played in a key at all, it must have been a minor one, full of all the blackest, most dissonant notes. No tune was anywhere to be found, and even if there was one, it would have been swallowed up by all the fortissimo trilling and the endless whops of the tone clusters. From his grand piano came so much banging that his friends, kind as they were, tried to put the best spin on things, affirming that the instrument was, after all, a member of the percussion family. So his audience was very limited, mostly to himself and one old deaf dog that begged for scraps at his door. The people of the town hurried past his window and tried not to show their displeasure. He was a very good man after all. In spite of all this, his friends, loving him as they did, were more than willing to endure a painful hour or two of his efforts. He was certainly very skillful, they thought, a master of his own musical language, and there was no end to his inventiveness. "Would you like to come in and hear my latest sonata?" he shouted from the barren window. And those unfortunate souls, kind as they were, nodded with a pained smile and labored up the stairs that led to his room. They squeezed around the piles of manuscripts and cringed before the battered piano. As he attacked the keys, they winced and squirmed, and privately they all learned to train their minds onto something else. The hands of the clock, the back of his neck, their next vacation, or a sweetheart waiting at the cafe. One thoughtful friend turned her mind to the tiny seeds in her pocketbook, and when no one was looking, she slipped them into the window box, then thought of warm rains, the golden sun, and what a good thing it is that flowers haven't any ears. The noise continued clattering on, but lost its sting. They wrote the event off as a lesson in the discipline of mind over music. Then they all ran out and took aspirins and hot baths. Later, when the musician cornered them on the street or in the cafe and asked them if they had enjoyed the concert, these good and tolerant people could not lie, and so found a way out with the clever use of language. "Your playing was remarkable," said one, thinking of the remarkable two-headed goat exhibited at the fair. Another said, "The music was full of surprises," as was the spook house at the amusement park. "It took my breath away," said another, as did the neighbor's pussy-cat when he had tripped over it and fell into the fish-pond. The musician beamed with satisfaction and promised to work hard on some new sonatas. Every one scratched their heads and wondered how such a good man could write such nasty, irritating music. Some of his friends, believing that there is good and bad in everyone, liked to think that all the bad in their friend came out in his music, and left nothing behind but good in the man himself. Early one morning, the musician woke everyone up as usual, putting the finishing touches on one of his sonatas. The deaf old dog came for his scraps, and a bunch of new flowers poked their little heads out of the window box. Then the old dog sniffed something strange in the air, and slinked away with a whimper. The devil, who had heard about the sonatas and had been up all night scheming, came out of hell for the sole purpose of hearing them in person. When up on earth, he always tried to blend in, so he pushed his prickly tail behind him and covered his head with a top hat. He cupped his hand around his pointy ear and listened from under the pretty window box. A great grin spread across his face, and he wiggled his warty tongue. "That's good stuff, really good stuff," he exclaimed. Then he said to himself, "Wouldn't it be splendid if we had such a fellow for #1 musician at home? That would be magnificent." But then he went away shaking his head, for he knew as well as anybody that the musician was too good a man to end up at a keyboard in hell. The devil pondered this problem off and on for a long time, and after a few years he had an idea. "If I can't have him, I can at least have his music," he said. The musician had completed 497 sonatas. "When he makes it to 500, said the devil to himself, "I'll just go up there and steal them all, and then I'll steal the piano, the stool, and that metronome thing too. Then I'll just sit back and see what happens." The musician didn't know of the devil's plan, of course. He went on with his work, scribbling out masterpieces of unparalleled irritation. Whenever he went out, little children would follow him, and birds would perch on his shoulder, and people would say, "Here comes the musician. What a good fellow he is, in spite of his nasty piano playing. Surely he's the best fellow in all the world." It wasn't long, however, before the 500th sonata was completed, and when that time came, the devil, true to his plan, sneaked up out of hell and stole everything. He hung the manuscripts in his art gallery, and he took the piano and all the rest to the great concert hall. "Now we must have a performance. Bring in my calendar," said the devil. So he looked over all the activities scheduled in hell for that month, and then pointed to a blank space between the fireball and the brimstone gala. So the date was set, and invitations were sent to all the critics and to hell's most extinguished luminaries. Everyone else fought over the tickets, for they were the hottest ones of the season. But the devil, in his hastiness, forgot a few small details. "I've got everything all arranged except the music. Who will play the piano and which sonatas? Hell is full of musicians, but most of them are mediocre and wouldn't know a sonata from a sewing machine. And I want a really big show. Yes, we'll play all 500 in a row. But who will play them?" The devil thought long and hard, and then he lit up and turned to one of his attendants. Bring to me the list of all the ex-clergy who are residing in hell. There I'll find somebody worthy of the task." He knew that many of the ex-clergy were very musical, and he had always felt a bit sorry for them for having to do that awful churchy thing all their lives, when their hearts had not even been in it, and having to endure all that sickening sweet music year after year. Now they'll be able to wallow in something substantial, he said, something true to their nature. They'll really be able to sink their teeth into this stuff. So the list of all the ex-clergy in hell was brought in and unrolled for his inspection. It stretched up and down the entire length of the throne room. The devil got on his hands and knees and with a big black marker crossed out the names of bishops, sopranos, priests and harpists, choir masters and bell ringers. When he was done, he had a select list of all the organists, pianists, harpsichordists, and anyone else who played on the keys. He summoned them to his art gallery, and there he waited. Some of the manuscripts had been nailed to the walls and dressed up in gaudy gold frames. They looked like square black holes. There were so many inky notes with barely a space between them. The devil beamed at these treasures and slapped on some varnish to make everything shiny. The gallery was very well attended that month, with streams of the damned and all manner of major and minor demons filing through every day to study them approvingly over a cup of punch. At last, all the ex-clergy who played on the keys were assembled in the gallery. "These are some of my beauties," said the devil, pointing to the manuscripts on the wall. "Memorize them well, then I'll meet you all in the concert hall for auditions." Up the grand staircase and above the door that led to the great concert hall was a bloodstone plaque. On it something was chiseled in florid, unreadable script. "What does it say, most incandescent one?" said one of the ex-clergy to the devil. "Why, that's my motto," said the devil. "More is better, and I'll live up to it or I'll be damned. Now let us begin and go into the concert hall." So they all took turns playing sonatas on the authentic instrument, and the devil kept a scorecard marked with what he judged to be the 3 most important musical categories. Finally, one young lady excelled far above the others, scoring the highest marks. She played the loudest, the fastest, and the longest. "That was marvelous, my dear," said the devil. "Now go out and knock 'em dead." All hell broke loose to hear the new music. The critics sat in the closest seats, with all their acid tongues glowing in a row. Extinguished luminaries lined the balcony, and everyone else squeezed in between. The sonatas went on forever. Everyone winced and cringed, squealed and squirmed in delight. The devil himself shouted above the racket, "That's real good stuff, really good stuff, isn't it?" And they all agreed. The critics praised the performance to exhaustion, and the next morning, in the entertainment section of the Hot Times, the headlines declared, "Remarkable, full of surprises, takes your breath away." So the sonatas became all the rage in hell and set the whole musical community on fire. Up in the world, the musician, meanwhile, was baffled by what had happened. He asked all around the town, but no one knew anything at all about the disappearance of the manuscripts, and even less about the theft of the piano and the rest. The artist grew very worried, because he was a poor man who earned money by keeping the streets clean, since no one ever paid him for his music, and he knew that he would have to do a lot of sweeping on a lot of streets for a very long time before he had enough money to buy another piano. "Lovely," said the devil, when word came to him of the musician's distress. "Now we shall see what we shall see." And he sat back and smiled and waited. As day after day went by, with no piano, nothing to write on or with, and nothing to do but sweep the streets, the musician began to alter. He stopped smiling, and he shooed the birds from his shoulders. He chased the little children with his broom when they tried to follow him. He kicked at the old deaf dog and mashed all the flowers in the window box. So he grew tiresome and ill-tempered, and even cast off from the friends who loved him. And when he walked scowling in the town, the people would move out of his way and say to each other, "Here comes the musician. What a terrible fellow he is after all, just like the music he used to play." The devil was enormously pleased by these developments. His plan was working perfectly well. "I'll have the fellow himself in the end, as well as his compositions," he said. And he sat back and smiled and waited some more. One day, however, as the musician was sweeping, he stirred up a cloud of dust, and began to cough and clear his throat. Then one note, two, then more squeezed out of him, and he thought it sounded pleasant, a new musical idea. He walked all the way home humming a little tune, which was clear, melodic, and in a major key. This was the beginning of a new life for the musician. He hummed more and more little tunes, similar to the first, then opened his mouth, and what a sweet voice he had, just perfect to experiment with. The people who had avoided him now stopped under his window. "He sings beautifully. What a tender melody," they said. And they went back to their own chores, humming the lovely tune. It wasn't long before he was asked to sing at the cafe on Sundays, and soon he made enough extra money to buy a little piano. He composed ballads and cantatas. Men dressed in suits with bow ties and tall hats came into his room and pored over the new manuscripts. Great sums of money were paid to him, and his compositions were published all over the world. Country churches and cathedrals alike sang his songs, and he was commissioned to write masses, oratorios, and cantatas. Every choir in the land loved his music, and in between their joyous tears the singers remarked, "It doesn't get any better than this." But the musician's ill temper grew worse and worse as his songs grew more beautiful. He became at last quite the opposite of what he had been before, and the people who had once been his friends, still believing that there is good and bad in everyone, said it seemed as if all the good in the musician now came out in his work and left nothing behind but bad in the man himself. The devil was hard put to understand what had gone wrong. On the one hand, he was well pleased with the kind of man the musician had become, but at the same time he was disgusted with his new songs. "That fellow is as useless to me now as he was before, and I don't know what to do," he said, gnashing his teeth. "So I will do the best thing, forget all about him." And that's just what the devil did. He forgot about the musician altogether, and turned his attention to other things. As for the musician, nobody knows what became of him. His sonatas are played in hell to this day, and his songs are sung in heaven. But the man himself seems to have been lost somewhere in between. No matter, he's sure to have plenty of company. The children sat still as statues, with all their shoes off. Sister Cecelia broke the trance. "Looks like you're all in a mosque, facing Mecca. Such pretty feet and shoes to match. In China, they used to bind up children's feet, toe to heel, very painful, but only the feet of the little rich girls. Then they brought in caged songbirds, nightingales. Their singing helped to ease the pain. Oh, never mind, there's the bell, and it's lunchtime, and that's another story."